if he had to answer in one sentence who the next president was, he would say the guy who got shot at. Again, referencing the Butler
Yep.
event.
According to his session work, something appears to be invading the host here that's involved in this competition or tournament, as he called it.
This person is thinking about philosophical things quite deeply that involve a lot of other people. It's a very large group of people. Um, it's noted that this person is sitting in this spot and this person needs like something like a reset button or like a do-over. Other ideas about having gone through and paid their dues. Some justice is noticed somewhere in there, like the general term of justice, not necessarily a Supreme Court justice, but more or less the idea of justice when in terms of law, in terms of righteousness, if you want to call it that. And ultimately, at the end of this situation, it seems as if this is like a renewal or a baptism, whether it's baptism by fire or baptism in general. I don't really have the feeling that it was some sort of religious connotation to it. Um, it just seems as if this situation is making this person better for having gone through this situation. It was kind of instructed to me by the project manager, Morgan. He was asking for a sketch of this person in a state, what we call a stage 6 exploration, and it's very much the same as a coordinate remote viewing session, where you're kind of going through and you're just kind of sketching. Once I got into that follow-on work, you've got this person with their like foot up on top of a rock pointing up towards something else. And this person is kind of sitting there looking around and determining where this person wants to go. And again, at this point, it doesn't say man, it doesn't say woman. It's mostly describing the situation that this person is. What is this person trying to do? Well, in front of this person that's standing on a rock pointing off into the distance is this big wall, like, cinder block wall or something along those lines. A barrier is what I labeled it in the sketch. And above, there's like it reminds me more of like a high jump bar in traditional style, track and field style, running in a semicircle, jumping up and trying to get over this bar. And this idea that this person is trying to get over the wall, but there's also this higher goal for this person that this person's, eyeing up and trying to figure out, how do I get over this? How do I get over the wall or get over this higher end post themselves for war in so as to complete the mission, whatever he's setting out to do, and whatever, I'm not he, but whatever this person is setting out to do. This person is looking, they're scouting, and they're grasping at ideals and concern to overcoming this barrier and reaching this quote unquote finish line for some sort of a benefit. This is a high bar or a very lofty goal to achieve. Earlier in the data, it also describes this situation as a dead end. Like the finish line is it. It's over. It's done. And when you kind of look at Kamala, like she could run for two different sessions or two different presidencies, and Trump can only do one. So for me, it seems based on this generalized idea, it suits Trump more in my mind than it does Kamala. It's the idea of the session.
Dan, I thought the first time I saw that sketch, it looked to me, especially considering you've got a high wall there, it looked to me like a pole vaulter. Like he was
Yeah.
about to stick that
That might
pole
be
in.
a better way of putting it. It's kind of the same with the high bar to get up and over. It's
Session results aren't necessarily always to be taken literally. Like, for example, actually, Dan's session that he's just described, and I think he'll agree with me. Well, I know
yeah,
that he will agree with me. Doesn't necessarily mean he's looking at a person literally standing in a muddy trench and trying to pole vault out of it or something like that. That's really more metaphorical, and the entire session is really kind of conceptual. Understand that that is very much in line with what you might expect um, from remote viewing results. Some of the other members of our group actually were unable to join us for this recording, so I'm actually just going to run briefly through some of the other work that was produced here. Now, this next session, um, kind of conversely, compared to Dan's session, actually probably should be taken quite literally, and I expect you'll understand why before I'm through explaining it here. So, what this viewer identified was the target is describing a large gathering event, a giant event, a big deal. It's a game changer. It's explosive. There's a big change happening here. Um, it's one of a series of large gatherings of a similar nature, and it's a movement representing an ideology. This all has to do with the judgment of a person. There's a central figure at these gatherings, a man wearing a suit. These events are of central importance to what this person is doing or trying to achieve. The person is described as being vocal with an arbitrary and decadent flow. He has a huge ego that is being reinforced by these events. The people here are moody, vocal, and charged up. There's some sense that he doesn't fully know what he is doing or where he is going with all of this. The man appears to be presenting or explaining. He is angry. He is calling people liars, saying they are wrong. He's laying out some plans, implying what the viewer calls a long form impeachment proposition. There is reference to a large screen with things projected onto it. And next, the viewer identifies the fact that there is an idea here that something is fired, something is abrupt like a cannon, a shooter in the midst. As the crowd disperses screaming, the subject is ejected from this place. He's taken away somewhere. So you can imagine what this session is talking about. He's quite clearly referencing the, what was it, the Butler, Pennsylvania around.
Yep.
Where there was an assassination attempt. It's quite clear that's what he's talking about. And I think it's probably safe to infer that not only is that the means with which the viewer's unconscious mind chose to identify the winning candidate, I wonder if there's maybe another layer of depth there, kind of implying that event right there is when and where he actually won the presidency. That very well could be. In any case, I thought that was a very interesting session, very solid, very tight. So I think it pretty much speaks for itself.
I'm going to side note real quick. This particular viewer that works with us, he's got a background mostly in technical remote viewing, but is also trained with accredited folks in the Hawaiian Remote Viewers Guild, which is a more visually inspired remote viewing methodology. And a lot of his stage 6 work comes from that methodology. He's kind of woven together in an interesting way. And to some pretty spectacular results in this particular session, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
So what he said during our previous chat was that if he had to answer in one sentence who the next president was, he would say the guy who got shot at. Again, referencing the Butler event. Morgan, could you also mention the Forrest Gump sketch there?
Yeah, the idea that this person is kind of like a Forrest Gump character in that in the scene where he starts running and he just keeps running and running and running and he just keeps going.
And all the people start to follow him. So it's like he's leading people, but maybe he's not completely 100% sure about how to go about this, in a Forrest Gumpish kind of way. I just thought that was interesting.
A pretty good analogy, in my opinion.
The next viewer, he describes things a little differently, and this is where it starts to get a little bit interesting. The viewer describes an individual. They're involved in a competition or a tournament. He identified something very interesting that actually leads directly into the fourth viewer session. All right, so viewer 3 here, I'll just quote his summary actually. In short, he may be in the early stages of a terminal disease, but he remains energetic. He gains energy from being involved in this competition. It's important that he remain viable reproductively. There is some mention at the idea of colonization and defending against it. There's also some concept of a battle between high status and low status individuals within a culture. There's also, sorry, I forgot to mention too, there's also the idea here of balancing reproductive rights. The viewer stressed the importance of this. So that was very interesting. He also states that according to his session work, something appears to be invading the host here that's involved in this competition or tournament, as he called it. Based on his data, he wouldn't draw a firm conclusion, and I actually didn't task him to go any further on that because that was really outside of the intended scope of this project. But he said he's fairly certain there's something going on here with a sickness, possibly a cancer. He also questions whether this is somehow induced or he's been poisoned. He mentions that this quickly reduces life expectancy. Now that pretty well leads us directly into the fourth viewer session, wherein he describes an interesting looking angular container with the viewing window making its contents visible. Visible inside is the carcass or corpse of a person with a dark yellow tan. What does that sound like? Interesting to say the least. So
I kept getting the idea that looking at that particular session, it was more or less, it seemed to me an impression that the analogy that I was getting off of it. And again, I'm not the actual viewer, but I was getting the idea of something like Lenin, how Lenin lies in repose. He's in a darkened room where he's, laying in this casket with a window over his head and, the lights on in there and that kind of stuff. Or maybe perhaps the idea of laying in repose at like the rotunda, the Senate rotunda, I think it is, in the Capitol building, where most ex-presidents lie in repose for, I think it's like 10 days, 11 days, so people can kind of come and, pay their respects or whatever you want to call it. I don't know. I didn't mean to interject too much. I just really had those kind of vibes coming off the session work.
No, I think that's perfectly valid. Although the session doesn't outright say so, it perfectly describes actually the scenario that's being outlined in that session. If you want to sum it up, we have Dan's session, which basically describes this guy in a very difficult rock and a hard place situation, and there is some indication that he's successful in achieving his lofty goal. We have the second viewer session, which effectively describes the assassination attempt at Butler, Pennsylvania. We have a third session that describes a man in a contest or tournament who apparently contracts some sort of a disease. And then the fourth viewer session, we seem to have an individual after their death on display somewhere. So effectively, as Dan said, lying in repose. So that's kind of the storyboard of the session work here. And based on that, I, as the project manager, when I started to see the work coming in, I pretty much knew what it was saying. I said as much to the viewers themselves. I said, I think as soon as you know what this target is, you're going to know what the answer is. And that was the case. They're in unanimous agreement.